Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Keegan. I am the Moinian Assistant Professor of Asian Middle Eastern Cultures at Barnard College, and I'd like to welcome you all to our third event of July. I'd like to thank the Columbia Global Center in Amman and the staff there for hosting this series of events where we are discussing Kalīla wa-Dimna, a collection of stories that feature fictional humans and talking animals. So thank you all for coming to our second of 3 academic workshops in the series. Our final workshop will take place on July 27th, and today we will be discussing the adaptations and translations of Kalīla wa-Dimna. For those of you who missed some of the last 2 weeks, let me catch you up. The tales of Kalīla wa-Dimna have traveled from Sanskrit to Middle Persian to Arabic and Syriac, and then from Arabic into languages from French and English to Malay and Japanese. There's also a lot of variation between the Arabic manuscripts of Kalīla wa-Dimna. So basically, many copyists felt free to adapt, augment, and adjust the text as they reproduced it. In the keynote discussion 2 weeks ago, Beatrice Grundler of the Free University in Berlin introduced Kalīla wa-Dimna and discussed the ERC-sponsored project about Kalīla that is ongoing at the Free University. That project, entitled Anonym Classic, is made up of over a dozen researchers, programmers, and staff, all working towards a synoptic edition of Kalīla wa-Dimna that would allow us to see all of these different Arabic versions of the text, and also to better understand the transmission of Kalīla wa-Dimna between languages. Last week, we discussed the digital aspects of this project and the nature of digital humanities in general. This week, we have scholars who are working on the adaptations and translations of Kalīla wa-Dimna. These stories came into Arabic as a translation, and they were massively influential both within Arabic and beyond Arabic. So that's kind of what we're discussing today. We have with us today Jan van Ginkel, who hails originally from the Netherlands and is a senior postdoctoral researcher at the Freie Universität, where he works on the Syriac versions of Kalīla wa-Dimna. He has published numerous articles on Syriac literature and history. We also have Theo Beers. Theo is a Persian and Arabic philologist who has recently defended his dissertation at the University of Chicago. In Berlin, he is a postdoctoral research fellow working on the transmission and translation of material connected to Kalīla wa-Dimna, especially between Arabic and Persian. And finally, Isabel Torvald is a senior postdoctoral researcher and deputy head of the Anonym Classic project. She hails originally from Spain, but she received her PhD in Tübingen, and she has published extensively on Arabic literature and late antique history. And finally, our discussant today is Lara Harb, who is assistant professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. And she works on Arabic literature and has recently published a book with Cambridge University Press entitled Arabic Poetics, Aesthetic Experience in Classical Arabic Literature. So without further ado, we have first up Jan van Ginkel.
Hello to everybody. My topic today is the Syriac versions of Kalīla wa-Dimna, and I'll try and share a screen with you so you can all see what I'm talking about. I hope this is all visible to you. What I'm talking about is central to the project is the ongoing development of variations, adaptations within the transmission of the designed collection of the stories known as Kalīla wa-Dimna. Now, this adaptation and variance does not only occur within one linguistic or cultural tradition, but it goes across linguistic and cultural boundaries. And Beatrice Grundler already indicated how broad that transmission is, just this to illustrate where the material is translated to in various languages in various periods. My interest is the Syriac Aramaic versions of this text, and for this we have 2 versions. the old Syriac version and the young Syriac version. What makes Syriac special in this relation, account, is that the old Syriac version predates the Arabic tradition. It was created already in the 6th century from a Middle Persian version, which is basically the origin of Kalīla wa-Dimna as we have it, because the sources, or the Sanskrit sources, are separate works which were brought together in this collection of the Middle Persian, in the Middle Persian language for the first time. And immediately after the creation of this Middle Persian version, it was translated into Syriac Aramaic. The translator is later in the 13th century referred to as a perioditis bud. Whether or not that is entirely correct can be discussed, but he clearly was, the translator was an Iranian who was then later Syriac educated. So Syriac was not his mother tongue. We used to have one manuscript dating from 1524, which sadly got lost in Paris at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, but luckily we have 4 copies of that manuscript from the 19th century. The second Syriac version, the young Syriac version, that's the term I will be using for this presentation, was translated in the 10th, 11th century, and it's based on an Arabic version, and relatively early version of the Arab Kalīla wa-Dimna, as most of the manuscripts in the Arabic tradition as we have it today date from later centuries. Again, the translator is unknown, probably a cleric. His mother tongue was probably Arabic, and he learned Syriac later on as well. Again, one manuscript from the 13th century with restorations from the 14th and 15th century. What we within the project have done is we've chosen one chapter as a kind of sample chapter to compare the various versions in various languages and within Arabic in the various manuscripts. And that is the chapter 5 in the old Syriac version, chapter 7 in the new young Syriac version, on the cat and the mouse. The frame story is a king that asks a philosopher about an example of a man surrounded by enemies and how to survive by cooperating with one of them. The unframed story, so the embedded story, is the story of a wild cat that by accident gets snared in a net by a hunter, but the hunter is not there. The mouse comes out of his hole, sees the cat, but he also sees an owl and a weasel who both want to eat him. And then the mouse has to find a way to save himself and comes up with the idea, if I save the cat can save me from the owl and the weasel, but the cat should not attack me, of course. So after some discussion between the two, they come to an arrangement, and the mouse gets near to the cat. The owl and the weasel think, oh, this is all over for us, and leave. And then later on, the mouse saves the cat from the net just in time before the hunter arrives, and both of them escape. The cat wants to remain friends with the mouse, but the mouse thinks, well, might be, it's too dangerous for me, and says, let's keep it a friendship with a certain distance between us. This is in principle the story, and if we compare the old version with the young version, there are, on the linguistic level, several differences. In the old version, the text is called Kalīla wa-Dimna, what of course reflects the Middle Persian name of the text, whereas the younger version also uses the well-known title as it is preserved in the Arabic tradition. Also intriguingly, in the old version, there is no specific name for the story embedded in the account. Whereas for the younger version, it uses the name matla, parable, which of course is a good, well-established Syriac term, but it also is well known in Arabic as mathal, and this parallel is probably not unintended. What is also interesting is that the old version retains quite a lot of names from the Sanskrit, like Yudhishthira and Bhishma, and whereas the young version uses just king and philosopher. So it has anonymized the central frame story. Also, in the old version, the names of the mouse and the cat still retain more or less the Sanskrit. Keep in mind that in Middle Persian, is no, in this written form of Middle Persian, there's no distinction between an L and an R. So Parith and Palita are basically the same. Rumasat and Lomasa are also similar. Whereas in the young version, Afridun and Rumi are more in line with the Arab Viridun and Rumi, which is not unexpected, but it shows a development within the text. On the level of style, the old version stays pretty close to the text of the Panchatantra, and as a result presents itself as a more or less verbatim translation. This needs to be seen within context. Verbatim doesn't mean word for word, but it is on a sliding scale closer to the word for word translation with additional additional activities of the translator. Whereas the young version is a more paraphrastic and has far more elaborations and a more flourishing way of presenting the story. Whereas the old version only has sayings and metaphors which are based on the Sanskrit Vorlage. I have to say most of them are reworked and adapted. For example, the story of the elephant, which is a very interesting element of the story to show the fear of danger. In the old version, it is a man sitting on an elephant's tusk. And in the Sanskrit version, it is the story of elephants being used to, tame elephants being used to hunt wild elephants. Completely different story, but it is an elephant story. In the younger version, there are far more additional sayings, possibly hikmah from the Arabic traditions, and metaphors and similes. Again, what is available which shows up in the Sanskrit as well, is again reworked and adapted. And for example, the story about the elephant is now the danger of sitting on an elephant. The old version is very down to earth and just tells the story, whereas the younger version introduces quite a lot of religious elements with sentences like, when the cat is in danger, I have no helper except God. And I think that God has provided for me of those who fear God. All kinds of sentences like that are added to the story. The story is set in a far more morally religious setting. As for the structure, the old version retains the numbering of the Panchatantra. So this is the 5th story, whereas the new version puts it in 7. Oh no, that's incorrect. The old version changes the line and makes it 5, and in the new version it retains the old setting and keeps it at 7. What is interesting is that the old version is shorter than the younger version. The younger version, and that is, of course, I showed already in the style that it has quite a few elaborations, is half as long as the old version. And we can see the difference also in the ending, where the old version just ends with, and thus mouse and cat were saved. The younger version really harks back to the first introduction by the philosopher and ends with the parable of the enemies who become friendly and familiar with one another, and afterwards they part. Which is that matla element is being reintroduced. So it has a more well-defined structure compared to the old version. As to the contents, the old retains the element of a weak person being the central theme of the person, of the chapter. A weak person surrounded by enemies. What is he supposed to do? Whereas the younger version and the Arab tradition only focus on any person surrounded by enemies. All through the story in the old version, it is stressed that the mouse is weak. There are some remnants of that in the younger version, but it has been more or less glossed over. In the old version, it is very clear that it is almost Machiavellian. When an enemy can be useful, befriend him. When a friend is harmful, become enemies. In the younger version, that is toned down as well. Love, which is a word that needs a whole lot of explanation in this context, but that will have to wait until the publication of this as an article, changes to enmity, and enmity ceases and love reigns, which is a far more gentle approach to the attitudes in this story. Again, in the old, hate and friendship are determined by harm and profit. Whereas in the young, sometimes necessity invites to love and makes friendly those that are remote. It is a toned down version of the old story. When the mouse is deliberating of saving the cat in order to save himself, he immediately assumes that the cat will understand their mutual needs. Whereas in the younger version, the mouse feels the need to explicitly first mitigate their natural enmity that exists between the two. In the old version, the cat always remains one of its enemies. So for the mouse in the old story, there are 3 enemies that he discusses with the cat. The mouse discusses with the cat only 2 enemies in the younger version. And again, the mouse in the old version waits with cutting the final threads of the net because he's fearful of the cat pouncing on him. So he does not explain it, he just does. Whereas in the younger version, he explicitly states, I will wait to cut until the hunter arrives. What does this all mean? What can we conclude from this? Well, there's a whole lot of material, of course, that I couldn't introduce in this short presentation, but it is very obvious that the old version stands very close to the Sanskrit version, has closer towards the verbatim pole on the adaptation translation scale, whereas the younger version has Arabic elements, but still moves towards the more paraphrastic pole, gives itself room to maneuver and change the story when needed. The old version is a clear, classic mirror of Prince's story, whereas in the younger version, morality plays a far more central role. The old version reflects the Middle Persian version, which is a Sasanian court story. It belongs to the court of the Sasanians and is actually educating young princes or something like that. The problem with that is, of course, there is no Syriac king. What is the audience of this text? And that is still something that for which I do not have an answer yet. It only may indicate that there was a very prominent Syriac presence near the Sasanian court, which even uses its own language to communicate in literature. Whereas the younger version is more intended for a more general audience, in which religion plays a role, although it's in this section unclear which religion it is. It could have been taken from Islamic texts. It could have been Christian texts. In other phases, other stories of this younger version, it's pretty clear that it is Christian, but for the example text, it is in between. What other aspects is, of course, is to what extent is there a form of adaptation taking place. Now, there is in any translation adaptation, of course, because there is no possibility of retaining all the elements of a source text in a target text. But it is rather limited. It stays relatively true to the Middle Persian text, as far as we can say, because we don't have the Middle Persian text, but it seems, compared also to the Sanskrit, that it stays pretty close to the original. Whereas in the younger version, it shows a far more open way of using translation. It is more paraphrastic, it is more driven by contents rather than by staying close to the text, the original text. The cultural element, the cultural environment in the old text, there is hardly any influence from a specific Syriac Christian environment on the text, whereas the cultural environment is clearly present in the younger version. And with that, I hope to have shown you that adaptation does occur not only within a tradition, but also across the boundaries of a tradition. And with that, I hand back to Matt.
Thank you so much, Jan. And we look forward to the next two presentations. I just want to remind everybody, I forgot to mention this in the introduction, there is a Q&A box, which you can find on your screen down at the bottom of your Zoom panel, which allows you to ask questions during the presentation. So I encourage you to do that as they come to you, because I will be filtering these questions to feeding these questions to our presenters during the Q&A session. So please add your questions now so that I can get a handle on them and present them later on. And now Theo will be discussing the Persian versions.
Great. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the Persian versions of Kalīla and Dimna, in particular one written in the mid-12th century Common Era by a Ghaznavid court official named Abul Ma'ali Naṣr Allāh Munshī. And now I'm going to share my screen. Just bear with me for a second. And is everyone with me? Matt, is it showing up correctly?
Yeah, we can see it. It's great.
Okay, good. So the title that I've given this is Naṣr Allāh Munshī's Preface to the Persian Kalīla wa-Dimna. I'm going to talk about topics slightly broader than that, although I will get to the preface for the last section of my presentation. I want to make a couple preliminary points. The first of which is that when we look at the development of Kalīla and Dimna as a textual tradition, it's beyond doubt that Persian is one of the key languages in which that development was pushed forward over the centuries. And that, of course, goes for Middle Persian, which is this important intermediary between Sanskrit and Arabic and Syriac. But even when we look at just the new Persian language that developed after the Arab Islamic conquest of Iran, But by the 4th or 10th century, there was already interest in producing new Persian translations based on the Arabic attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa. There are a number of texts that resulted from this, and they're diverse in both form and style, and I'll mention some of those shortly. So it's the first point really is that the Persian language and Persian literary tradition contributed repeatedly to the development of Kalīla and Dimna as a textual tradition. But one thing that I always like to mention is that we should also consider the inverse of this, which is that Kalīla and Dimna served as an important vehicle for the development of Persian literature and Persian art. So these two agents, right, Persian literature and Kalīla and Dimna, can be said to have been together from the start, and this was a centuries-long fruitful partnership. I'll just list some of the Persian versions of Kalīla and Dimna that we have. I don't want to get into this in detail because it would take too much time, but we have at least 2 versions that are known to have existed from the Samanid period. One of them in prose, translated into Persian from Arabic by Abul Fazl Bal'ami. This is not extant. We have a verse adaptation of this that was done by the poet Rudaki. Fragments of this do still exist. The first really major extant Persian adaptation of Kalīla and Dimna that we have was carried out in this 1140s Common Era by a secretary at the Ghaznavid court named Naṣr Allāh Munshī. This is particularly important because it's often considered the original work of what's known as artistic prose, or Nasr Fanni in Persian. Sometimes this is also referred to as ornamental prose, or Nasr Masnu'. This is not the first work of literary prose in New Persian, but it is seen as being a major step forward for the development of Persian belles-lettres. And Nasrullah also, he weaves tons of quotations from Quran, Hadith, Arabic and Persian poetry and other sources into the narrative of Kalīla and Dimna, giving it a very distinctive style. This also survives in multiple remarkably early manuscripts, including 2 manuscripts from the 12th century, which is, from the Arabic perspective, very, very early. Another version that was produced in Persian almost contemporaneously with this was done by a certain Muhammad al-Bukhari. This is in the late 1140s. He also translates from the Arabic of Ibn al-Muqaffa, and he's producing his version for a Zangid ruler in Mosul. And this text survives in 1 early manuscript, also from the 12th century. In the 13th century, there's a Persian versification based on Nasrullah's version. This is done under Seljuk patronage by Qani Tusi. And then one more that has to be mentioned is a new Persian take on Kalīla and Dimna from around the end of the 15th century Common Era by Hussein Vaiz Kashifi, a Timurid author. This new version is titled Anwar Suhaili, and it becomes one of the most influential works of Persian prose literature of the early modern period, and was influential even on other languages. This was translated into Ottoman Turkish and other languages besides. So that's just a quick list of some of the Persian versions of Kalīla and Dimna that we have. And I just wanted to connect this to a couple of the broader questions that we're dealing with in the Anonym Classic project. We're always talking about the range of ways in which Kalīla and Dimna was translated and adapted in a large number of languages, and cultural contexts and historical periods. But even if we just look within the case of Persian, there's already a significant variety. Everything from straightforward prose translation from the Arabic, like Bukhari did, or Nasrullah's intricate style where he interweaves quoted material from the Quran and poetry and so forth, or the approach taken by Vaiz Kashifi, where he adds a large number of entirely new stories to Kalīla and Dimna. And then, of course, we have multiple versifications. And then one of the larger questions that presents itself here is, well, what was it about Kalīla and Dimna that made it plausible, that made it desirable for there to be this continual production of new versions, new adaptations over the course of centuries? What is it about this book in particular? Because this is certainly not typical, not within Persian and not within Arabic and not within many of the languages that contributed to this textual tradition. But I want to turn my attention to the version of Naṣr Allāh Munshī. And the first thing I want to show here is what I've mentioned about the way that he interweaves quoted material into his Persian narrative. Now, I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but what I've done is I took one of the shortest chapters in Kalīla and Dimna, the chapter of the lioness and the horseman, and I'm just going to scroll through the several pages of this. It's, again, very short, and I've left a note in red each time that Nasrullah has added something from outside Kalīla wa Dimna as a quotation. So here's page 1, page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, I'm just going to sum this up. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but over just the 6 pages, and this is in the edition of Mujtaba Minovi, in just 6 pages, Nasrullah has added 5 snippets of Persian poetry, 4 snippets of Arabic poetry, 3 amthal or hikam, 2 Quranic verses, and a hadith. And that's all original to his version. I mean, these are all things that are not present in the Arabic versions attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa. And it can also be said that, so Nasrullah has translated Kalīla and Dimna from Arabic into Persian, but he's then taken all of this outside Arabic material and added it back in, such that the result is effectively a bilingual text. And that's one avenue of research that I'm pursuing with regard to Nasrullah's version. But I'd like to move to the preface, because that's what I said I would talk about in this presentation. So aside from all of the enrichments of the text, of the narrative of Kalīla and Dimna that Nasrullah engages in, he's also added his own pretty substantial new preface to the book. And this preface is concerned primarily with explaining the importance of the book, and especially its importance in illuminating the path of just and prudent rule. And Nasrullah sets all of this in an explicitly Islamic framework, which is a step that had not been taken by Ibn al-Muqaffa in his own translation from Middle Persian into Arabic, which was also done in the Islamic era. But so Nasrullah takes things in a much more explicitly Islamic direction. And I even showed that in the slides from the chapter of the lioness and the horseman with the Quranic verses and the hadith. Those are things that he weaves into the narrative, but also the preface itself very much furthers this mission of sort of Islamizing, or again, creating an Islamic framework for the stories of Kalīla and Dimna. In Nasrullah's view, rulers, kings, are absolutely necessary for the flourishing of Islam. Those rulers, in turn, need to act with justice in order to be effective. And a book like Kalīla and Dimna is full of valuable examples of both good and bad conduct and shows the results of those. And so Nasrullah makes this into a sequential 3-step argument for the importance of Kalīla and Dimna for rulers and commoners alike, but especially for rulers. And this is ostensibly why he wanted to create this new Persian or Perso-Arabic version dedicated to his Ghaznavid patron, Bahram Shah. And really, one of the main reasons that I like to talk about the preface, or the reason I'm talking about it today, is that I'm working on a new English translation of the entirety of Nasrullah's preface to Kalīla and Dimna. And this is in the context of the publication recently of a complete English translation of Nasrullah's Kalīla wa Dimna, which was done by Wheeler Thaxton and was just published last fall. I excitedly picked up a copy of Thaxton's translation and noticed as I went through it that a lot of this outside quoted material that Nasrullah folds into his narrative is omitted in the translation, including most or all of the poetry. And then when we turn to the preface, if you turn to the preface, you'll find Thaxton makes the following footnote. He says, much irrelevant material in Nasrullah's excessively long-winded introduction has been deleted in translation. And so this systematic, rich preface that Nasrullah went to the trouble of adding to his translation adaptation of Kalīla and Dimna has been cut in this new English translation to just a fraction of its original length. And so I thought, okay, I'll make an unabridged, fairly literal translation just of Nasrullah's preface. And I intend this to serve as a sort of companion piece to Thaxton's translation. And I'm going to add notes and commentary to that. So that's what I'm currently working on. And the last thing that I want to share right now is just a few examples of passages from the preface showing both the original Persian again in the critical edition by Mujtaba Minovi, and the translation that I have right now as a work in progress. So the first sample here starts with Munshī explaining, again, this inextricable tie that he sees between kingship and religion, and especially between effective kingship and the flourishing of Islam. So he says the indication of this fact by the master of prophethood is as follows: kingship and religion are twins. He refers to kings as kings of Islam are the shadow of the creator. Muluk Islam saye afaridigarand. And he then goes on to say that the key role of kings is that they're able to enforce the laws of Islam, at least in a way that people would never follow them out of the sweetness of worship. He says the sweetness of worship cannot in any sense have the same effect as fear of the sword. Continuing on to a slightly later passage, he quotes a Quranic verse from Surat al-Hadid, in which it says, indeed, we sent our messengers with clear proofs and revealed with them the scripture and the balance that people might observe right measure. And we revealed iron, in which there are great power and benefits for mankind. And then Nasrullah offers an interpretation of this verse where he basically says, these three items, scripture, the balance, and iron, might not seem to be connected at first, but if we consider the different necessary roles of these things in the worldly flourishing of Islam, then it in fact makes a great deal of sense, in that the explanation of religious laws is through scripture, the presentation of the gates of justice and equity is through the balance and the reckoning, and then the effectuation of these concepts is through the sword. So again, he's saying the sword is a necessary step along the path. And then I just wanted to show one last passage where I mentioned earlier that he has a three-part argument where he transitions from the necessity of kingship in Islam to then the necessity of justice for kingship. And this is the point where he makes that transition. He starts by explaining that anyone who allows any treason to occur on their watch will be blameworthy in this world and punished in the next. For the harm of treason against one's ruler is also tied to the judgments of religious law, shariat, and both elites and commoners of the community will suffer from this. And then he says, this part of the virtues of rulership, that it is consequent to religion, has been established. Now let a few of the merits of justice, which is a valuable adornment and a priceless gift for kings, be mentioned. And here he transitions into step 2 of the argument. And later he goes on to step 3, which is that Kalīla and Dimna is a book, again, that illuminates the path of justice for rulers and commoners alike, but especially for rulers. I'll stop there just because I don't want to take too much time. But I have a list as well of a few of the key features of Nasrullah's preface to keep in mind. First, again, this is fully original material. As much as he weaves things into the narrative of Kalīla and Dimna, this is the only full section that Nasrullah has added out of whole cloth to the book. And so he's perhaps even more free here to pursue his own style. We see the same use of quotes from the Quran, Hadith, and so forth, but here it's in the service of a systematic argument for the importance of just kingship in Islam, and then also for praise of the Ghaznavid dynasty. And finally, later Persian adaptations of Kalīla and Dimna, including Kashifi's Anwar al-Suhaili, would have their own new introductory sections, but still keeping in mind that Nasrullah was writing this in the mid-12th century, with very little precedent for this style of prose literature in Persian. It's remarkable to recognize the sort of idiosyncratic vision that Nasrullah had, and just the extent to which he contributed to the development of Persian belles-lettres. I will stop there, and I'm happy to talk about any of these points in greater detail in the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Theo. And we now have Isabel Torvald talking about an Arabic adaptation. Isabel.
So thank you very much. I want to thank also the organizer for making this possible. That's really exciting, and I'm very much looking forward to the comments of all of you here and outside. So I will now share my own presentation. So The Book of the Panther and the Fox and Other Siblings of Kalīla wa-Dimna. One important aim in our project is to reconstruct the reception history of Kalīla wa-Dimna and to investigate how it was read, valued, and understood in different times, as well as how it was accommodated to varying readers' expectations. In this paper, I will discuss the Book of the Panther and the Fox and Nimr wa Tha'lab by Sahl ibn Harun, a booklet that apparently was perceived as connected to Kalīla wa-Dimna by Arabic reader already in its time, so that it can be understood as one of Kalīla wa-Dimna's earliest literary responses or siblings. Let me give you here a brief outline of my presentation. After a brief introduction to the author and his time, I will proceed to sketch the key features of the text in terms of content, style, and structure, and then highlight the most important similarities and differences between Nimr wa Tha'lab and Kalīla wa-Dimna, followed by some preliminary conclusions. Sahl ibn Harun was a well-known personality of early Abbasid times, a Persian author and eminent member of the Abbasid bureaucratic class, the so-called Kutab, and lived approximately 2 generations after Ibn al-Muqaffa, the translator. He was secretary of Harun al-Rashid's vizier, Yahya al-Barmaki. Later, under al-Amin, he had close contact with the latter's vizier, al-Fadl ibn al-Arabiya, and under al-Ma'mun, he won the sympathies of his vizier, al-Fadl ibn Sahl. The caliph al-Ma'mun, put him then in custody as so-called Sahib of the Bayt al-Hikmah, the caliphal palace library, famous for its rich collection of Persian and early Arabic law. It is well attested that Kalīla wa-Dimna was part of this library. It is also important to consider that Sahl is said to have worked on selections and compendia of Kalīla wa-Dimna. So the content of the book. The booklet tells the story of the fox Marzouk, the wolf Murkabir, and the panther al-Muzaffar ibn al-Masur. It starts narrating how the first is driven from his homeland by a flood and strands on an island, where he meets an unhappy, depressive wolf. As for the reasons, the wolf Murkabir tells him about the king of this island, that it is a tyrannical ruler, the panther al-Muzaffar. Marzouk recommends the wolf to ask the king to appoint him as governor of a rich province, and so to gain wealth and honor. After some reluctance, the wolf follows this as his advice, and he is given by the king the post of wali, or governor of a distant province. The wolf appoints the fox Marzouk as his vizier secretary. The wolf gets rich and powerful. However, he does not correspond the panther king with gifts and revenue as the latter expects. There follows an exchange of 8 epistles between the king and the fox, who, as his secretary, writes the letters in the name of the wolf. Despite the fox's brilliant letters to the king and his endeavors to give moderating advice to the wolf, who, by the way, never follows this advice, the tension rises between the tension. Sorry, I got lost for a moment. The tension rises and ends in a war. The wolf is defeated and executed. The fox is also in danger to be killed, but can convince the king in the last minute to pardon him by pointing at his talent as advisor. The king commands his ministers to test the capacity of the fox as advisor by posing a long series of questions about the human nature, ethics, religion, etc. What follows on approximately 40 pages, more than a half of the whole book, is a long Q&A list that functions as didactic exposition of the basic of moralizing adab. As is to be expected, the fox passes the exam, the king is impressed by the beauty of the fox's mind and the excellency of his speech and nominates him as advisor until his death. End of the story. The structure of the book. It can be roughly divided into 3 key sections. The story about the flood and how the fox arrives on the island on 3 pages, the time of the fox as advisor of the wolf, particularly the epistles in 29 pages, and the exam by the ministers on 40 pages. Furthermore, the book begins with a formal hamdallah and a short exposition of the goals of the book, kind of Amar Bharat section, addressed to the reader, what means that it follows broadly the literary conventions of the time. In terms of style, the book encompasses a broad spectrum. It varies between plain prose in the short narrative passages, then rather rhetorical dialogical passages interwoven by proverbs, poetry, Quran, and hikam, many of them quotations of Kalīla wa-Dimna, in A and the beginning of B, And finally, highly rhetorical and parallelistic passages, often in satire or rhyme prose, in the epistles of B and in the explanatory sermons of C. In terms of narrative structure, it is kept quite simple. It is heterodiegetic. It is a straight linear plot on one narrative level, attributed to anonymous they say, and most passages consist of dialogues, epistles, and speeches. It is remarkable that those few passages that narrate the turning dramatic events, the flood, the fights, the war, are very brief and contracted and seem only to serve as connectors to explain the change of scenery. As said, the focus is rather put on the dialogues, sermons, and epistles, which gives Sahel occasion to display his mastery as stylist and show off as an adib knowledgeable of the ethics, philosophy, and morals necessary for a political advisor. There are no embedded narratives at all, also no prolepsis or analepsis. The plot is simple and almost dispensable in some parts. So if we compare them, both texts, the differences between An-Nimr wa-Tha'lab and Kalīla wa-Dimna are obvious. The simplicity and even dullness of the narrative structure, the lack of entertaining embedded stories that illustrate the moral advice, no plots with exciting intrigues and ruses, then the Islamic flavor, for instance, the Arabic names of the animals, the Quranic quotations, and also formal elements as the Hamdallah, the general focus on ethics and morality, and the sophisticated artistic prose style in some passages. The text does also not present itself as a translation of foreign origin. A remarkable feature that deserves more attention that I can give here are the quotation strategies in An-Nimr wa-Tha'lab. In contrast to Kalīla wa-Dimna, which is in its earliest version seems neither to quote or allude to other pre-existing intertexts, An-Nimr wa-Tha'lab is highly intertextual in many passages, particularly in the first sections. In the first two sections. It is to be said that some later copyists of Kalīla wa-Dimna have inserted quotations later, probably in a move to adapt the book to the tastes of the time. And as we have seen, in a way, is something that Munshī is also doing in his own translation, what we have seen from heard from Theo. If we then look at the selection of references, we will find the usual suspects of adab: pre-Islamic and Umayyad poetry, Quran and Proverbs, Hadith, almost known, that's interesting, one saying attributed to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Particularly intriguing is the frequent reuse of Kalīla wa-Dimna. It is never indicated but embedded in a similar way as Quranic citations and the Proverbs. It means it is integrated in the speeches as in a sort of iktibas. It is interwoven, and it is exclusively hikam that are used. Furthermore, and maybe not surprising, they are usually used by the Fox in arguments that are rather Machiavellian in content. Finally, there are occasional reuses of other works by Ibn al-Muqaffa, like Al-Adab al-Sarid. In comparing An-Nimr wa-Tha'lab and Kalīla wa-Dimna, the most important similarities are to be found, first of all, in the use of the trope of talking animals to discuss political and ethical issues. It is the idea of connecting the genres of animal fables and Mirror of Princes, a hybrid initiated by Kalīla wa-Dimna and also to be found in other imitations of Kalīla wa-Dimna or siblings, as Al-Asad wal-Ghawaz, a text I cannot discuss here. But, and my hypothesis is that Kalīla wa-Dimna was inspiring in this regard, since talking animals could be used as an effective literary strategy to derive responsibility and avoid censorship in political literature. What it did by putting sensitive political situation and statements in an overtly fictional, timeless setting. Giving advice was important for good government, and being close to political power opened great career opportunities for ambitious, talented people, but also from lower social background, particularly in early booming Baghdad, where talented Mawali, as Sahel was, could make fulminant careers. But the life as politician was also very risky and precarious, and caution, indirect communication skills, cunning, vigilance, and smartness were crucial, literally, to survive. The biography of Sahel, who witnesses the assassination of two of his ministerial patrons and hardly could escape death at least once, attests the crude historical reality of the Mawali advisors of the time. As a reminder, Ibn al-Muqaffa himself was executed under al-Mansur under obscure circumstances. There are also striking similarities in the sceneries. Many passages contain the classical advice situation, like in Kalīla wa-Dimna. You have a king ruler who poses questions to his advisors' ministers, either to his favorite one, who then gives didactic speeches, or to several of them, whose opposing answers represent the different options the ruler has when taking a decision. We also find the dramatic trial situation in both texts. It means a person is in danger to be executed. Three ministers give contradictory advice, as well as the trope of the advisor who saves his life because of his intelligence, rhetorical skills, and knowledge. A good speech can save lives. Finally, there are other parallels that need to be investigated further. For example, the triad Panther king, wolf governor, and fox secretary in Nimr wa-Thalab seems to mirror the constellation in the lion ox chapter of Kalīla wa-Dimna, where we have the lion king and the two jackals. Furthermore, in Kalīla wa-Dimna, the lion king is said to have been surrounded in his court by wolves, jackals, and foxes. And then the story continues telling the story about the two jackals, Kalīla and Dimna. One could say that Nimr wa-Thalab tells the story about the other animals at court, namely the wolf and the fox. And the panther is like a second kind of representing the Lion King, a parallel to the Lion King. The trial of the fox in Nimr wa-Thalab also parallels partly the one on Dimna, since like Dimna, it is the fox himself who advocates his interest, though the fox is never portrayed as cunning and deceitful as Dimna, and he is not punished. If I will end up with some hypotheses and thoughts for further inquiry. I think we can rightly say that Nimr wa-Thalab is a kind of literary response to Kalīla wa-Dimna in its broadest sense, since it supposes the pre-existence of Kalīla wa-Dimna as inspiration, and probably even worked better if the reader already knew Kalīla wa-Dimna. Sahl, evidentially familiar with Kalīla wa-Dimna, does not only reuse passages of Kalīla wa-Dimna, but also reassumes its innovative idea of combining an animal fable with political advice and adapts it creatively to a cultivated, other-proficient elite audience. His adaptation, however, supposed substantial changes in form and content, and the result is in many ways less entertaining and more erudite and didactic than Kalīla wa-Dimna. So, further questions. With which analytical tools can we capture better the nature of this relationship between both texts? So what is the connection between both? And what would this connection say about the reception of Kalīla wa-Dimna in its early stages, which is one of the intriguing topics in our research, because our manuscript are much later. Could we say that Nimr wa-Thalab is a kind of other-biased version of Kalīla wa-Dimna, more oriented to a restricted elite readership of cultivated udaba and kutab? Actually, I think that Nimr wa-Thalab requires a reader familiar with many intertexts. It means Quran, early Arabic poetry, sayings, proverbs, etc., and who finds pleasure in reading fine Arabic artistic prose and poetry. This supposes a rather limited audience connected to a certain historical and cultural context, a specific one in Abbasid Baghdad. Whereas in contrast, Kalīla wa-Dimna is much broader in scope. It addresses all readers, young and old, cultivated and popular. Kalīla wa-Dimna is, of course, it is more sophisticated in its narrative structure and operates on two semantic levels, on a superficial, entertaining level and on a deeper philosophical level. However, I think that Kalīla wa-Dimna does not require a cultivated but a smart reader, and the wisdom encoded is transculturally intelligible. That makes, in my view, Kalīla wa-Dimna much more adaptable, versatile, and translatable. And as such, I would say that it has the quality of a classic that Nimr wa-Thalab doesn't have. So I would stop here, and I very much look forward. So there you are.
Great. Thank you so much.
To the discussion. So thanks.
I will pass this on now to Lara Harb, who has some response and questions for the panelists. For those of you in the audience, we have over 80 participants hanging out, watching us on Zoom or Facebook. Please post questions in the Q&A box so that I can then feed those questions to the panelists so they can respond to them in the chat box as we go. Lara?
Thank you, Mats, and thank you all for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I've already learned so much from the past couple of panel discussions you've had. We're seeing for the first time, I mean, through this Anonyme Classique project, I mean, how little we actually know about this very known text, but at the same time, an outline of its shape and history is already surfacing. So thank you for this exciting and important work, all of you involved in this project. So I'm gonna address some questions to all three panelists in a row, and then I'll hand over the stage to them to give their opinions and answers. So the three presentations today give us a nice snapshot of the various manifestations of this collection of stories in Jan's presentation in translation. Specifically, Theo emphasized the added prefaces and the authorial intervention of Naṣr Allāh in his version. And then Isabel looked at contemporaneous or quasi close to the original text sibling texts or that are not quite part of Kalīla wa-Dimna, but are clearly in conversation with the text, influenced by it and referring to it intertextually. So first, starting with Jan, I mean, something interesting actually about all three presentations is that you are getting at versions, some version of Kalīla wa-Dimna that are actually in one sense or another older than the oldest Arabic version we have of Ibn al-Qaffa. We know that the earliest dates from the 13th century, the oldest Arabic, physical Arabic manuscript. And we don't know how close it is to what Ibn al-Qaffa actually wrote. So it's really valuable to see, for example, the Syriac translations, which are even older than Ibn al-Qaffa, to see Sahel ibn Harun, which whose text is older than the version we have of Ibn al-Muqaffa's, yet it's in conversation with this original Ibn al-Muqaffa text that we don't really have access to anymore. And then Nasrullahs is also from, what was it, 12th century, which is older than the oldest Arabic manuscript we have. So these are all valuable, if only for these, from a chronological temporal point of view. They can give us insight into the Arabic and what potentially was there in the lost Arabic versions, or potentially there. Okay, so in Jan's presentation, looking at the translation first from Middle Persian, that is pre-Islamic, from the 6th century, and then another translation from an early Arabic version, which we don't have anymore, from the 10th and 11th century. Despite lacking the original works, of which the Syriac the Syriac versions are a translation, you nevertheless are able to make convincing speculations about the literalness or not of the translations. Also, you argue that the older version, the translation from Middle Persian, seems to be directed more at a political elite, whereas the newer Syriac translation, on the other hand, seems to be more directed towards the everyday man, exhibiting general lessons of morality, or even specifically Christian ones, although not in the example you showed us. So my first question to you, Jan, was concerning the originals of these two that we don't have access to anymore. The source, the versions of the text in the source languages, and how much is the difference that you are finding due to the original versions, Middle Persian and Arabic versions, of which the Syriac are translations, and so in other words, could we deduce from this difference in the two Syriac versions that you're pointing out that the Middle Persian was originally more elite and the Arabic was meant for more general, as a more general work on ethical behavior for the everyday man? And perhaps as part of your answer, you could also address what you're describing as religious language in the Syriac version, translated from Arabic, and what makes it markedly Christian. If you could give an example, that would be great. And then a more general question regarding the Syriac textual tradition and literature. How much do we know about Syriac literature in the respective contexts of the two versions? What are the genres and the kinds of texts that have survived or that we know of in the Syriac tradition, and how does Kalīla wa-Dimna fit into that world? I know this is a big question, but it would be good to get a sense of the state of our knowledge of the Syriac tradition in these periods. Theo, in his presentation, takes us to the Persian Kalīla wa-Dimna, and in this case, again, as I mentioned, the earliest version dates to the mid-12th century. In manuscripts that are from that period, which is significant. And you highlight how important these, first of all, authorial intervention is, and how much Naṣr Allāh Munshī actually was an author of his version of Kalīla wa-Dimna in the text itself, but also in the preface to the text. And you highlight the significance in general of prefaces, which is a tradition that starts, starts before Ibn al-Muqaffa probably, but Ibn al-Muqaffa's own preface is also highly informative. And then all these later added prefaces by the likes of Naṣr Allāh Munshī and the others that you pointed out also give us a glimpse into how the text was used and for which purpose, as well as an authorial voice, in an otherwise anonymous text. And you also point out, which I wasn't aware of, that the Thaxton's translation actually is taking out a lot of the distinctiveness of Naṣr Allāh's voice in his translation. So you make us aware of the importance of these things to get to access this unique occasion that we have to a voice, to an authorial voice. And you make the argument interesting. I mean, it seems like Munshī is presenting a political philosophy in his preface. So I don't know how far you've done in this, if your research has done this far yet, but does this stated agenda, which you presented, Islam, justice, and the sword, and the relationship between like the ideal rulership, a just ruler, does this then translate into the construction and choice of stories included in Naṣr Allāh's version? A lot of the stories in Kalīla wa-Dimna, from what I'm aware of, are stories about cautioning against being tricked by devious tricksters, advisors, and they don't necessarily instruct how to be a just ruler. If you've looked into that, could you talk a bit about how these stories are molded or chosen to showcase model rulership that is Islamic? Or is the preface kind of separate and has nothing to do then with the actual collection of stories? And then more generally, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what's going on. You highlighted the fact that Kalīla wa-Dimna, the translation in the 12th century, was not only a reflection of the literary style in the period, but was actually part and parcel of the development of the literary style in Persian prose in that period. From the political philosophy point of view, what is going on? Where's Munshī getting his ideas of this just Islamic governments, this way of rulership? Is this part of a larger philosophical outlook that exists at the time, or is he inventing it by himself? He doesn't have a precedence, you said, in producing such a preface. So where is he, what is he adapting, or is he really just inventing a new philosophy? Finally, Isabel, you take us back to the 8th century with Sahel ibn Harun, a favorite of Jahil, to quote in his works. And this is one of the few texts that have survived by Sahel, that's not through quotation. This tale, as you show, puts in the mouths of animals speech and tales about relationships between viziers and kings and advisors and secretaries. And in that sense, it resembles, and these are tales that we should learn one, and ideally a king would learn from. And this resembles Kalīla wa-Dimna in this way, besides the more direct quotation and intertextuality that you pointed out, and perhaps even a complement, like a sequel, where you're suggesting that some of the animals in Kalīla wa-Dimna that we don't know their story is being told, the fox and the wolf, which is an interesting idea. So it's significant, again, that you're looking at this text because it gives us access, as I mentioned earlier, to a text that was almost contemporaneous to Ibn al-Muqaffa, giving us an idea what's going on right there, as close as possible as we can to Ibn al-Muqaffa's time. And it's gives us, it is similar also, as you mentioned, in terms of having animals talking and discussing political and ethical issues. Yet it seems to be Sahl's own composition. So he's right, that's also unique. I mean, Kalīla wa-Dimna is explicitly a translation, and Sahl is inventing his own thing. And you highlight that Sahl was a secretary in the Abbasid court, and you suggest, intriguingly, that the story of An-Nimr wa-Tha'lab might reflect his own personal life. And this made me think, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say. First, are you suggesting that there might be some autobiographical elements to this fable? Can we investigate whether this could actually be the case? Maybe not, maybe it's impossible, but I'd like to hear what you think. And then could the emphasis on the dialogue at the expense of plot, I don't know if you mentioned this, but you pointed out how it's not as sophisticated from a narrative point of view as Kalīla wa-Dimna, but could it be doing something completely different? Is it not is it maybe a transcript of actual dialogues, actual letters put in the mouths of animals? In other words, is it to be read as a parable or an allegory? And finally, at the end, you make the claim that Kalīla wa-Dimna's adaptability, versatility, and translatability are the characteristics that ultimately give it the quality of a classic. Whereas Sahl's story, you're suggesting, is much more rooted in the specificities of highly cultivated Arabic culture and literary heritage that narrows its potential audience. Could you perhaps elaborate more on the idea of a classic and why translatability and adaptability are necessary characteristics of a classic? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. This is wonderful. We are running rather close to when we'd like to wrap up, but I want to give the presenters a chance, perhaps starting with Isabel, on one of Lara's last questions, perhaps about the classic. There's been some questions about that in the chat box as well, about translatability, you know, what makes this particular text less, travel less or be less adaptable. So perhaps you could address one of those, and then we'll also promote some of the audience members into video feeds so that they can ask some questions live to our other panelists.
Okay.
Go ahead, Isabel.
Okay, thank you. So then I will just answer to the classic questions and not to the others. Am I right?
Sure, that would be great, so that we can move on.
So, okay, that's a big thing, okay, of course. What is a classic and what makes a book to be a classic? And of course, there are several different definitions. But one of them, and that's what I would use here, is the idea that it is a kind of timeless quality, a kind of universal quality, so that a text might survive over centuries and in different contexts of time and culture. And so that it can be reused and reread again and again, and you find new things and you can adapt it to your own, let's say, context. And from this perspective, I see that there is some resemblance between being a classic and being translatable and adaptable. And that was a thought that, well, I'm just at the beginning of like comparing Sahel with Kalīla and using Sahel to explain Kalīla, which is a certain perspective. But I think that it is important to look at what happens at the same time, to understand what happens to Kalīla, and maybe to understand why Kalīla was in a way successful, which is a kind of ambiguous thing, because it was successful in the sense that it was read and copied through centuries and translated into so many languages. But on the other hand, it was a failed text in another aspects, and it did not achieve that much the status of high literature that was transmitted in scholarly milieu. That was something that, for example, Beatrice Gründler is highlighting in the transmission history of the text, what explains this variation thing. So, and that is what I can say to that. And looking at the differences between Sahel and Kalīla, that is where I came into this idea that it could be related to that thing. So to understand Sahel, you need this kind of background, Quran and Arabic poetry and so on. So you have to be cultivated in what we would say broadly adab. But that's not that much the case for Kalīla. You can read it without knowing anything about Quran. You can read it without knowing anything about whatever. You have to be just smart and have some kind of common sense and human experience. That is what I would say to that.
I think that actually addresses some of the questions that were posed to Isabel in the chat as well. We have some more panelists who have posed some questions of their own. Prashant, do you have you had this question for Theo, and I was wondering if you could pose it to him more eloquently than I could summarize what you've said here, and give a chance for Theo to answer that question and maybe some of what was posed with Lara's question. Thank you for coming. You're muted right now, so you need to unmute. Thank you. Welcome.
Am I muted still?
We can hear you now.
You can hear me now? Okay. Well, I'll have to actually recall my question because I sort of formulated it and then I don't see it now. Basically, it was more a remark and a suggestion because Theo, thank you, Theo, for that wonderful presentation. You posed this question towards the beginning about what possibly allowed this text to circulate so widely in ways that were not usual in Arabic and Persian. And it struck me that if one looks at the sort of Sanskrit hypotext, I don't know how relevant they really are and how much of a real split there is between maybe the textual trait is lost, but from the Sanskrit into the Pahlavi, or even maybe it wasn't Sanskrit, maybe it was Prakrit. I remember this Iranian scholar, what's his name? He suggested that it was probably Prakrit, so some kind of Prakrit used in what is now Afghanistan. At any rate, if one looks at the Panchatantra in the Sanskrit and its larger genre, which is Niti, and the Arthashastra sort of as a kind of main text, it really is amoral. There is a kind of validation of amoral social climbing. Whereas you see in Naṣr Allāh Munshī's version that Dimna is explicitly executed. I mean, his execution is a punishment for his social climbing. So, whereas there is no real punishment, in the Panchatantra. It just struck me, just an observation. So perhaps, the absorption was through a certain moral filter into the Arabic already via the Syriac, maybe. That's just a thought that might speak to the question of, its circulation.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really interesting question that also ties in a lot of the issues that were raised in Jan's talk and some of the Q&A questions. So Theo, do you have something that you might want to say about that and Lara's comments?
Yeah, because that I think ties in nicely with the question that Lara asked about, well, if you look at the different morals or the different messages that seem to be coming out of these stories in Kalīla and Dimna, it's certainly not the case that all of them are straightforwardly about how to be a just ruler. I mean, there are all sorts of different actors, some of which are rulers and some of which are scheming, talking animals, and the positive and negative effects of the different courses of action that they pursue are all sort of, we get really a wide gamut of that in this text. And that is something that I could see as being valuable for its relevance and its circulation. And something that Nasrullah also says later in his preface is that he absolutely does see this as a work that's valuable for commoners and elites alike. So it's not only for rulers, although I would say it's primarily for rulers, at least because that's who he's directing his adaptation toward. And the other thing I would add there is that there are stories in which what's being emphasized is the virtue of clemency, right? There's the King in His Dreams chapter. That's what that's about. There are stories in which what's being emphasized is accepting the natural order of society and not trying to shake things up and move above your station or change the hierarchy. There are stories about not being deceived by one's enemies, the owl and the crows. So yeah, maybe it's not only justice, although he does emphasize that in the preface, but there's also just prudence and street smarts and not tricked and knowing how to act in a given situation and knowing what are the different options and what might result from the different courses of action that one could pursue. So that might also, there is certainly a moral standpoint that we find in Kalīla and Dimna, at least by the time of Nasrullah's translation, but there may also still be reflections of the sort of the more neutral or even absent moral perspective that there might have been in the earlier Sanskrit tradition, if only in the wide gamut of situations and options and results that we see in these narratives.
That's really great. I think that actually links to one of the questions that Lara asked about Jan's presentation in terms of the context, Christian context. You know, what points us to the particular moral or religious context of these Syriac versions. Jan?
Yes. There was also a question about that in the Q&A I saw. If you compare both texts, and it's not as clear in the chapter that we have chosen for a sample text because for other reasons, but if you, for example, read the introduction from the younger version, there is a whole passage of that Christian morality within the Christian community has gone down. Very specific, and it needs to be there needs to be more moral guidance, and the author explicitly says, I am now handing you this text to give you that moral guidance, which shows that this younger version was clearly seen as more of a moral guidance rather than a mirror of princes, whereas the old Syriac stays far closer to the texts from Sanskrit, the Mahabharat. This is part of the Mahabharat, and those texts were clearly intended for a court setting and probably also for an educational setting for people who at some point will be in a leading position. All those elements are present in the old version, and also intriguingly enough, in the old version, if there's a problem and there is a practical solution, and it's morally maybe not very acceptable within Christian or Islamic morality, it's no problem, it's in the text. That is being retained. And in that sense, it's a far less Christian and far less moral text, and far more something of a mirror of princes. Is that enough of an answer, or do you want more of context?
No, I think that's great. We have a couple other panelists who have joined us to ask some questions. Rachel Peled, you've posted a question in the chat box, and I was wondering if you'd like to pose that live, if you can unmute yourself and say hello.
Hi. First, thank you very much for the overview. It was really fascinating. My question, what I put in the panel, I want to widen it a little bit. I am working on the Hebrew versions of Kalīla and Dimna, and the most interesting is that as Jews weren't rulers, and at this time, just the subjects, the whole focus is different. It can't be a guide for the rulers because they weren't rulers. So the whole focus is from the moral side, from most of the aspects just Theodore was talking about them now. And what I wanted to ask is if there are other prefaces in other works like Barlam and Josaphat, also because in the Hebrew version we have a very interesting preface that goes in this direction. And also in the other works, in the Kalīlas in Hebrew, we still don't know from where they are, where their source is, no? And I suspect that maybe there can be some influence or from this Persian or from the Syriac or from both versions because of the context and because of these focuses. And if you can tell
yeah, Theo, so about are there prefaces in other or other texts of this kind?
That's a good question. I don't know with reference to Barlam and Josaphat. In fact, I think Isabel would probably be in a better position to comment on that particular example. I can say that for any number of important texts in the Persian literary tradition, adding a new preface was always sort of one of the standard moves that one could make, and that was done for the Shahnameh. It was done, for instance, for Bal-Ami's translation and update of the history of Tabari. So the idea of adding a preface is it's one of the most common things that you would see added anytime something's been adapted or updated for a new context. But I don't know about Barlam and Josaphat, and I would love to find more about that in particular.
So I want to follow up with that on, there are a couple questions in the chat about this, about ethics, where these notions of ethics come from. There's a question about Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, whether that has influence on Arabic versions or the moral themes in the Panther and the Fox. And one of our panelists, Andrew McLaren, has a question about also ethics. So I thought we could sort of wrap those questions in the chat box into an add to Andrew's question. Andrew?
So the question that I wanted to ask was for Theo, but I think Jan might also have something to say about this. So not that long ago, I was reading this text in the Kadam Akhlaq by a guy called Radiyuddin Naysaburi, who dies in 1201. And he quotes a ton of wisdom literature from Persian figures, but only in Arabic. Even though his text is largely in Persian, whenever he quotes Ardashir, it's in Arabic. And so I was wondering about, what exactly does it mean to translate these things in a bilingual environment, right? Where, on the one hand, Middle Persian obviously has a very special role to play. The idea that, governance and religion are twins, that's a Sasanian idea as far as I know. But on the other hand, everybody seems so comfortable sort of just shuffling these materials to make their points. Even as you were arguing, Theo, in the context of trying to articulate like a particularly Islamic idea about what's just governance. So in this context where all these materials are circulating, I mean, what are we to understand by translation? Maybe what did somebody like Naṣr Allāh Munshī understand by translation?
Yeah, that is the big question, isn't it? I mean, that's really difficult to say. And one thing that I've repeatedly wondered about reading Naṣr Allāh's version is that he has produced something that could only be it would only be intelligible to someone who can read both Persian and Arabic. So then what's the point to begin with? And why would you translate Kalīla wa-Dimna in its entirety from Arabic into Persian and then add so much classical Arabic poetry and hadith and Quranic verses back into the text directly that you would still have to be someone like him or someone like his associates who's fully educated in both languages in order to understand it. And I think then you have to ask, well, there must be some other reason that you would want to translate something. Although I don't think I've fully gotten to an understanding of that yet. There must be some formal function that can be carried out by a translation that wouldn't be accessible to just the text as it was in Arabic with the extra material added, which Munshī could easily have done. But others probably have more to add on this.
Isabel, do you have Jan? You want to add something?
Well, maybe it's just, I think we're right at the beginning of thinking about, but I think that in a way, it's something that I have suggested to Theo as well, that maybe he's doing like trying to imitate this way of doing adab that always goes away, is always connected with quoting certain type of texts. And he's doing the same, but he's translating the base text into Persian, but he keeps the citations in Arabic because they have to be in Arabic in a way as authoritative texts. So I think it would be very interesting, and that's something that I really am thinking about now, is how to look how he quotes and how, for example, Sahal ibn Harun is quoting and what is he doing there. And I think it also indicates that Arabic has a semantic value of its own. So it's not about the content, but about the language itself. So to quote Arabic gives a certain message. That's what I can say at the moment. That's the ideas that I have in this regard. But I think it's very interesting, of course.
This is really great. I really appreciate all of the questions we've gotten, and thank you to our additional panelists who have joined us, Prashant, Andrew, and Rachel. I'm sorry that we've had to move on so quickly. We need to wrap up now. But for those of you who posted questions in the Q&A box, we have a record of those, and the panelists are able to email you afterwards to send you direct responses to your questions. So they will not be like lost in the ether somehow. In the chat box, which is different from the Q&A box, CGC Amen has just posted the link for the final workshop in our series, which is next week, Monday, same time, same place. So I hope you all stay well, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again to Lara and all of the panelists. Bye, everyone.